Thank you. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be back here in Belgrade. People must recognize that they cannot make up for failing to regulate their numbers or care for their land by conquest in war or by migrating to another people's territory without their consent. John Rawls, The Law of Peoples. Assuming that either a particular war or that wars in general can to some extent be morally justified, and assuming that wars are meant to be won or ceased as quickly and in as morally justified manner as possible instead of continuing past the time in which it is necessary to, say, defeat an unjust enemy, it is important to ask who or what, if anyone or anything, wins in wars. Whereas the folk meaning of the word win and its cognates in the context of wars is that an agent or group of them achieves its ultimate aim of, say, ending a war by forcing through military action or the threat thereof the opponent's official military surrender, I mean by the word win and its cognates a significant benefit to or success of oneself or others. And by the terms benefit or success, I mean these terms in their economic sense. But when I say that a war is won in the moral sense, I shall mean by this that a party to a war has all relevant things considered, done the right things, and in a morally virtuous manner, that it has conscientiously followed certain rules of warfare that are in themselves just. It is important to note, moreover, that my account of war winning is both positive on the one hand and via negativa on the other. For in discussions of winning in wars, it is vital to understand as best we can senses in which winning in war obtains and senses in which losing in war occurs. Furthermore, it is one thing to ask what it means to win in wars, all relevant things considered, while it is quite another to ask what it means to win in the processes of a particular war or wars in general. Does anyone or anything really win in wars in either the general or more particular senses? If some party or another does win in wars, in what senses might this or that party win? It would seem that winning in wars is a matter of degree, and that it is often an unbalanced judgment. So for X to win economically, either in the processes of a particular war or in wars more generally, would appear to mean, at the very least, that X obtained a net increase of benefit or success from a particular war effort or with respect to wars in general. Thus, in order for X to win in war, X must have actualized a net increase of benefit or success as the result of either the war in question or with regard to wars in general. Something akin to this point is recognized by Anthony Quinton when he writes, "To say that the War of 1939 was the real cure for the depression of the 1930s is to say that the countries that had been economically depressed in the 1930s recovered when and because many of them started to go to war with each other." Quinton recognizes then that certain countries such as the US, the one in that cluster of wars that we refer to as World War II, to the extent that the US experienced significant economic recovery as a result of its participation in World War II. Furthermore, X might not even engage in war militarily, except in some rather indirect or remote sense, yet profit most from it, compared to other parties somehow affected by said war. Examples of this sort of winning in war would be the various countries that did not participate in World War II, yet benefited because they might have eventually been invaded, occupied, and annexed had the Allied forces not in the end been victorious. Had the ambitious goals of the Nazi regime been realized, then by now the entire globe might have been under its vicious control. Incidentally, one is reminded here of Francis Cam's discussion of the deterrent justification of war in order to prevent a worse harm from occurring to a people, for instance, the Nazi victory, Nazi victory, then what a war against Nazi Germany would likely cause to them. Alternatively, such countries might have benefited greatly in economic terms because some of their businesses manufactured some weapons of war or otherwise significantly assisted in the war effort of other states. In turn, these businesses created relatively lucrative employment opportunities for many thousands of its country's citizens. And it need not be the case that such countries declared war or officially entered the war or cluster of wars that we call World War II. In this sense, then, we might say that such countries joined or participated in the war effort, though they did not officially enter or declare any war associated with World War II. In any case, winning in war in this manner is construed in terms of benefiting economically from a war, even though said countries do not officially and perhaps militarily enter a war in some direct sense. Additionally, winning in a war or wars in the unbalanced sense requires a tabulation of every aspect in which a war or wars affect or affects a party to one degree or another. And given the complexities of war, it is unlikely that one wins in war in any of these senses comprehensively. For example, to win a war, morally speaking, is to engage in the activities of war such that one does the morally right things, say, in accordance with the best overall construal of some of the basic precepts of the just war tradition, including the satisfaction of the just cause condition and the minimization of collateral damage in terms of persons and non-persons. At least this is the part of the just war tradition that I assume for the purposes of this paper. And there is at least one sense in which winning in wars need not entail that the winner is morally right or good. History is replete with examples of evil empires that conquer others, including the US and its lengthy train of colonialism and otherwise militarily invading and occupying various other countries or societies for its own gain in terms of empire and in terms of the benefits it brings to certain US-based businesses, often under the guise of rescuing other peoples from the evils of communism or this or that person that it has persuaded many as a despot. Nevertheless, the Allied forces of World War II won in war in the moral sense in many but not all respects, not the least of which was their ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany, which brought an end to the Nazi killings and other forms of brutality. However, even such a great victory in that cluster of wars and battles was marred, morally speaking, by the Allied retaliatory bombings of German civilian targets. By this, I do not mean to include the strategic military targeting of businesses supportive of the German war machine, but rather the targeting of German civilian housing in particular, such as the British and US bombings of Hamburg in 1943 and of Dresden in 1945. And of course, there were the unnecessary and unjustified US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, quite subsequent to the US's crippling of Japan's military. No attempt to either break the will of the enemy to continue to fight or to exhibit the extent of one's military might or to flaunt vengeance, even when one is on the side of justice in war, generally speaking, can justify the intentional targeting of an at most relatively innocent non-combatant. Collateral damage, even if it can ever be morally justified, is justified only to the extent that it prevents a greater harm. I concur with Thomas Nagel when he writes of the bombing of Hiroshima by the US that in attacking the civilian population, one treats neither the military enemy nor the civilians with that minimal respect which is owed to them as human beings. Indeed, Jeff McMahon is correct in arguing that in such cases, otherwise just combatants become legitimate targets of defensive attack to the extent that they engage in warfare that deliberately targets non-combatants. Thus, considerations such as these show that a reasonable moral assessment of the Allied forces militarily winning Germany's surrender in World War II is tempered by its bombings of civilian targets. Not only did the US lose World War II, morally speaking, to the extent that it engaged in such bombing behavior of non-combatants, it also failed the just war tradition requirements of necessity and proportionality. For it was unnecessary that such bombings occur in order to secure the surrenders of Germany and Japan, respectively, but the degree of lethal force employed was significantly beyond what proportionality permitted, even if the targets were combatants. There is a real moral sense, then, in which the US did not win that cluster of wars that we refer to as World War II. This is especially the case if surrender could have been achieved by simply holding a meeting with German and Japanese emissaries at the US atomic bomb testing site in Nevada or in New Mexico. It is plausible to think that such a meeting would have resulted in the expeditious surrenders of both countries. Or, as Rawls argues, it was a failure of statesmanship that led to such atrocities during World War II. Or I would add, indeed, the needed but absent statesmanship might well have involved an invitation to witness the results of the bomb testing to which I just alluded. And what perhaps made that failure possible, Rawls argues, was the public failure to take seriously principles of the just war tradition. Rawls concludes, "There is never a time when we are excused from the fine-grained distinctions of moral and political principles and graduated restraints." Having laid the groundwork for my discussion, I shall argue that one necessary condition of winning a war in the broad sense is that the winning parties conduct themselves in a morally just manner in all relevant things considered and in the on-balance senses. But while this is easy to claim, it's far more difficult to defend in light of various moral dilemmas of war. Also, I shall argue that there is an economic argument often overlooked by just war theorists, it seems to me, one that can be tied to the moral argument. And it is this. It is unjust, I shall argue, for a state to enter into a war that will pose undue economic hardship on itself or other states that are undeserving of such hardship. Some cases of genuine self-defense constitute exceptions to this rule, including cases of defenses of innocent third parties. This principle is intended to apply to cases of offensive wars as one reason why they cannot be justified. And the claim here is not only that offensive wars eventuating in the economic hardship of innocent targeted civilians of another state are morally problematic, it is also that the offensive states themselves, insofar as they enter into wars and pose serious economic threats to their own citizens, are morally problematic. For economic hardships significantly affect the manners in which decent peoples can live. With McMahon's point about the ambiguity of the word war in mind, then, we might want to say, with regard to who won which wars of World War II, that there is little question that Great Britain lost its war with Germany, both in terms of about 500,000 soldiers and civilian losses, and in terms of its post-war economy being in shambles. Many surrounding countries fared similarly as a result of the World War II era wars with or occupations by Germany. Overall, as David Roden points out, about 55 million lives were taken, about 40 million became homeless, and much of the global culture and material wealth was laid to waste. Perhaps the Soviets won its war with Germany in terms of controlling much of Eastern Europe during several decades following the war, and the U.S. seemed to thrive economically and in terms of its spreading its military, economic, and political tentacles throughout much of Europe as a result of its war with Germany. However, many Allied soldiers were killed, and on the Soviet side in particular, millions of non-combatants were also killed as they were forced to defend their homeland from German military invasion. Insofar as on balance and all relevant things considered judgments of winning in World War II against Germany are concerned, it is difficult to imagine how entire countries won in that cluster of wars due to the fact that so many human and animal lives were taken. On balance, it seemed that each of the Allied countries and each of the Axis ones lost. Nonetheless, it makes sense to say that the Allied forces won the event of World War II and that they defeated the expansionist attempts of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and that they stopped the continuing Holocaust of various peoples deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. And for that defeat, the world is forever grateful. While millions of lives were taken for no overall good reason, given that the offensive military expansions of the Axis of countries were morally unjustified and that they did not satisfy the just cause condition, it was morally the right thing to do to defend against, indeed, eventually to defeat, such military attacks and advances. In some sense, lives of soldiers that could have and should have been spent in the normalcy of everyday experiences of love, compassion, and dignity were sacrificed by many conscripts and other enlisted military personnel who placed themselves in harm's way to stop the evils that were part and parcel of the event of World War II. Morally speaking, World War II is a lose-lose event for all relevant parties in that of the incalculable loss of lives. But there are senses in which World War II was won other than in the traditional military sense, or are there? While World War II was a losing proposition in the moral sense because of the millions of innocent lives that were taken, certain persons in the businesses some of them own or manage profited particularly well during that cluster of wars. Automobile manufacturers, both in, at least for instance, the US and Germany, benefited tremendously from it, incurring essentially guaranteed profits from the government-sponsored sales of vehicles of war. Munitions manufacturers also benefited significantly from the wars. Moreover, in the cases of such businesses, however, it is unclear that overall victory in war is even a desire, except, of course, insofar as victory might tend to breed a further willingness of many civilians to support additional wars. After all, oftentimes success serves as the basis for additional attempts at certain behaviors. Also, more profits can be realized if a war were to continue than if military victory is achieved in some traditional sense, and quickly. So there are parties to a war effort that might not publicly express their desires that a war continue, perhaps continue even indefinitely for the sake of self-serving profits. Yet in other cases, such as the United Fruit Company in the mid-20th century, a business might serve as a primary influence on a government to go to war in order to overthrow another government so that the business in question stands to profit. McMahon is correct when he argues that such states admit of some degree of civilian complicity in wars and thus bear a degree of liability to defensive military attack. So in a sense, the economic winning in war oftentimes is accompanied by a moral loss in terms of liability to military attack, and I would argue, sometimes including terrorism. Moreover, winning the war on terrorism is typically construed in the U.S. as the U.S. government's assigning its military to defeat terrorism by way of high technology and military might, while simultaneously devoting more than $1 trillion on a system of homeland security to defend against terrorist attacks both domestic and abroad. However, these methods of addressing terrorism normally ignite and inspire more terrorism, eventuated in hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis being killed and maimed, mostly by U.S. military action in Iraq, costs U.S. citizens trillions of dollars that could be better utilized elsewhere in the U.S. budget, fails to recognize that some in the U.S. are thoroughly deserving of the harshest kinds of violence and death, at least retributively speaking, and has been roundly deemed by security experts to be ineffective in making U.S. citizens safer overall. So the U.S. is very much losing its war on terrorism, both in the moral and economic senses. As I've argued elsewhere, the comprehensive moral, economic, and political costs to the U.S. for countering what a relative few have done to the U.S. in response to U.S. support of Israel and U.S. global military hegemony are astronomical, suggesting that the U.S. has already lost its war on terrorism. For even if the U.S. were to eventually secure a final victory, militarily speaking, over terrorism, the costs incurred seem already too high. But this matter leads to another important consideration concerning winning in wars and losing in wars. Perhaps an unexpected subject in this discussion is the issue of war crimes and the holding accountable and proper punishment of war criminals. Why? Because to the extent that this is accomplished in a reasonably just manner, the world wins in wars. I mean that figuratively speaking, of course. I assume here that the world wins when due process-based justice is achieved, including retributive justice. By this I mean that humanity wins when those who deserve it are punished in approximate proportion to their harmful wrongdoings. For to the extent that war criminals are brought to justice is the extent to which the world wins with regard to what occurs in war, including the declaration of unjust wars. Here I do not mean the bringing to bear political and economic power to punish whom one sees fit, as surely has been the case in some instances where those who were punished by powerful states that were hardly in moral positions to do so. Rather, I mean the bringing to justice of those who are genuinely guilty of war crimes by relatively innocent parties in accordance with due process of law. In this way, the world wins in wars, even when the wars themselves are, on balance, unjust. So long as reasonable justice is sought and achieved regarding war crimes, the world, to some meaningful extent, wins in wars, even in cases where, on balance, the wars are lost. And this is true even though the world, or at least this or that state attacked in the wars, suffered greatly. This is because a genuine sense of collective responsibility for the war in question is realized, a responsibility aimed at giving war criminals what they deserve based on their degree of retroactive liability responsibility for their support of the war in question. The matter of reasonable or approximate justice is no mean result when it can be achieved after such atrocities, for it provides appropriate responses of states to war criminals because they deserve it based on their respective levels and degrees of responsibility for their war crimes. And if the punishments genuinely fit the crimes in question, they might even serve to deter, to some meaningful extent, future attempts at such crimes. Retributive justice is essential to conduct after each instance of war as a means of achieving, retrospectively, winning in wars. For it is the winning in war in terms of the reasonable meting out of retributive justice. However, when injustices occur in war, including the injustice of the declaration of an unjust war, there is in general at least a double effect of loss. The first is when the injustices in war occur. The second is when such war crimes are not adequately punished or compensated. Superb examples of each of these kinds of loss in the commission of war crimes and in the evasion of justice by those most primarily responsible for them are found in the most recent 2003 to the present military invasion and occupation of Iraq by the U.S. For not only was that so-called war in significant violation of basic just war principles, it led to a conglomeration of violations of human rights and anti-war crime statutes found in the Geneva Convention, such as the unlawful detainment, lack of legal representation for the accused and detained, and torture of terrorist suspects by the U.S. government, often by way of the contracting of private companies to perform the so-called services so that those contractors would not be legally bound to the same legal restrictions as agents of the U.S. government, such as U.S. soldiers. Yet even to this day, as many in the former Bush administration are being sued for war crimes, they continue to evade prosecution in U.S. courts, thereby affecting their immunity for such crimes. I have in mind not only George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, and so forth, along with his top cabinet members, but the Bush Six, who are the lawyers who effectively redefined the legal understanding of the term torture in such a manner such that what happened to many suspected terrorist detainees in Guantanamo Bay and in various other locations throughout the world with U.S. governmental consent, and knowledge, and approval no longer constituted torture under U.S. law. The world loses both morally and socially when war criminals are not brought to justice. Not only is the right thing not done to them in terms of holding them accountable and punishing them as appropriately as possible, but insofar as they go unpunished or significantly underpunished, they may continue to serve as threats to national and international security. So I find that it's at least odd and a waste of valuable time and effort for organizations such as the Center for Constitutional Rights in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit organization insisting that it seeks justice for, among other things, war crimes. The reason I find this problematic on moral grounds is not because they seek convictions for those they deem as war criminals. Rather, it's because of the organization's explicit, extremely pacifistic stance on the punishment of war criminals. Catherine Gallagher, for example, an active prosecutor working for the organization, admits that she will never seek capital punishment for even the worst of war criminals, not even life imprisonment. She's against any lengthy prison term for such harsh war criminals. perhaps the harshest of all criminals in the sense that many are primarily responsible agents for the killings of hundreds of thousands of innocents. But in exactly what, except in extreme pacifistic sense, can this be morally justified? And exactly how does such dogmatic pacifism honor considerations of moral responsibility, approximate proportional punishment, and deservedness? It does not, yet it masquerades as an organization seeking justice for war crimes. However, it does no such thing except to send the message that some such people cannot be on the side of genuine responsibility, approximate proportional punishment, and deservedness as they pertain to war crimes of the harshest varieties. It is vital that when such war crimes are punished, that the offenders are provided due process according to the law. But when they are duly convicted, absent meaningful mitigating circumstances, they must be punished in approximate proportion to the harms that they wrought on others. In the case of those who declare unjust wars, any punishment short of execution and seizure of all personal financial assets in order to provide some meaningful measure of compensatory reparations to the victims of the unjust war is itself unjust, as it violates considerations of justice and proportional punishment. It is bad enough that war crimes are committed, but added to these evils is the further one of shirking from one's moral responsibility to impose what justice requires on war criminals because one lacks the moral fortitude to do the right thing in terms of punishing such war criminals. Pacifism of a certain kind can become a rather morally pernicious dogma in such cases of war crimes. It must be set aside so that genuine, though approximate justice can be pursued with cautious due process, rights-respecting vigor. Furthermore, this must be attempted in good faith despite the fact that, as Rodin points out, international law has no independent enforcement mechanisms. Moreover, entire societies lose in wars to the extent that racist stereotypes are often invented and tend to survive and even thrive during post-war eras. Take the anti-Japanese racism of many whites in the U.S. during World War II. This racism is featured in some U.S. children's cartoons of that era, and no doubt made politically and socially acceptable to many the establishing of internment camps in California in which thousands of Japanese American citizens, and even many who morphologically appeared to many white U.S. citizens to be Japanese, were forced to work without pay. Many lost their businesses, jobs, and so forth, only to be compensated in terms of reparations in the amount of only $10,000 per family imprisoned. While it might be justified to, in some people's minds, to despise one's enemy combatants, sometimes even its loyal citizenry, insofar as their government started an unjust war and all that that involves, it's hardly justified to create and sustain racist stereotypes that can and often do last for generations, adversely affecting even those who were not even born at the time of the initial incident that led to the stereotypes in the first place. Wars are often breeding grounds for racist attitudes and behavior. Morally speaking, no one wins in war where racism thrives. Of course, ultimate expressions of such racism, of which wars include the genocide of American Indians by the Spanish conquistadors, the British, the French, and the U.S. governments and their armed forces, as well as Germany's genocide of Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and certain others deemed by the Nazis to be undesirable, just prior to and during the World War II era. Of course, there are other losses in wars. Ordinary soldiers do not win in wars. Here I have in mind those conscripts and others who serve on the front lines predominantly out of a sense of economic necessity, as opposed to career military types who often serve out of a sense of genuine patriotism. While it is true that some soldiers and their loved ones may derive some level of satisfaction out of military heroism, the fact remains that serving as a soldier robs one of a far more productive life they could have enjoyed had they not either conscripted or enlisted in the military in order to engage in war. Wars are filled with countless cases where postal workers, peace officers, firefighters, contractor apprentices, apprentices, teachers, and so forth, had their careers or their more ambitious career prospects placed on hold, and most never return to them or even have an opportunity to pursue them. Instead, their lives are in essence taken from them just as they had begun adulthood. How can it be said that, on balance, soldiers win in war? They are often forced, again, by less than optimal economic circumstances to serve as warriors, and if they return from war, they experience the curse of suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Many of them do, and being the last ones to be hired even in a good economy. So they endure the social stigma and psychological struggles that accompany most war veterans, and the remainder of us do not even notice them. Many become homeless, unproductive, and substance abusers. Hardly a victory in any meaningful sense. Most soldiers do not win in war. If they're not killed, they often wish they had been killed in battle once they return home to experience the anxiety and depression that await them. Do normal citizens win in wars? As mentioned, they can win when the military invasion of their country is avoided due to war. However, many women are raped in war, either female troops by fellow troops or non-combatants by troops. Non-human animals often suffer and die in a myriad of ways, either by being used as a means of war or by being the victims of war in other ways. War displaces many, psychologically harms, often destroys entire ecosystems, and there are orphans of war, both human and non-human. While it's possible for individuals and businesses and even countries to win both a war and in war, most instances of war eventuate in an unbalanced net loss when all relevant things are considered, both moral and economic. And this is true of even those defensive wars of which we can be most appreciative. Thank you.